In the crisp autumn of 2018, the residents of Willow Creek, Massachusetts, awoke to a chilling revelation. The serene suburban town, with its tree-lined streets and white picket fences, was rocked by the shocking murder of Dr. Henry Carter, one of its most respected figures. Whispers spread like wildfire as details trickled out. The 50-year-old doctor, a pillar of the community, had been found dead in his own home, shot at close range. For a town that prided itself on safety and decorum, this was unthinkable. Henry Carter had always seemed untouchable. A man of intellect and charm, he ran Carter Family Clinic, the most reputable medical practice in the area. Patients adored him, colleagues revered him, and his successes afforded him a life of luxury. Yet, behind the Georgian facade of his sprawling home lay a marriage in slow decay. His wife, Margaret Carter, a poised and intelligent woman, had grown distant over the years. Their conversations had become perfunctory, their affection long buried beneath the weight of Henry's demanding career and Margaret's growing suspicions. Margaret had every reason to believe Henry was hiding something. Her once loving husband had become evasive, his gaze often lingering too long on his phone during their silent dinners. He worked late more often than necessary and seemed preoccupied, his mind elsewhere even when he was physically present. But Margaret was no fool, she had learned long ago to bide her time. If Henry had secrets, she would uncover them, and when she did, he would regret every moment of deceit. Unbeknownst to Margaret, the first piece of her puzzle fell into place on a chilly morning in May 2018. Lila Collins, a 28-year-old woman with piercing eyes and an air of vulnerability, walked through the doors of Carter Family Clinic. The young receptionist-to-be had been drawn to Willow Creek in search of a fresh start. Her marriage to Ryan Collins was suffocating. Ryan, a man of rigid discipline and possessiveness, had eroded Lila's sense of self with his constant scrutiny and harsh words. The job at Henry's clinic was her lifeline, a chance to reclaim her independence and rebuild the confidence Ryan had chipped away. When Lila met Henry for the first time, she felt an instant connection. His warm demeanor and effortless charisma set him apart from anyone she had ever known. During the interview, he asked about her life with a genuine interest, making her feel truly seen. For Henry, Lila was a breath of fresh air. Her youthful energy and wide-eyed hopefulness contrasted sharply with the growing void in his own life. By the end of their conversation, he offered her the job on the spot. Lila left the clinic that day with a renewed sense of purpose, entirely unaware that this decision would set off a chain of events destined to consume them both. At first, everything seemed innocent. Lila excelled at her job, quickly becoming indispensable to the smooth operation of the clinic. Henry and Lila's interactions were cordial, professional, and occasionally marked by light-hearted banter. But as the weeks passed, their bond deepened. It started with stolen glances across the reception desk and brief moments of shared laughter during coffee breaks. To an outsider, it might have seemed harmless, but inside the clinic's walls, an unspoken tension began to simmer. For Henry, Lila represented something he hadn't felt in years: excitement. Her laughter brought life to the sterile halls of the clinic, her enthusiasm igniting a spark he thought he had lost forever. For Lila, Henry's attention was intoxicating. Here was a man who listened, who valued her opinions, and who made her feel desired in a way Ryan never had. Their connection was magnetic, and resisting it soon became impossible. By late summer, their professional boundaries had dissolved entirely. It began with lingering conversations after hours, each peeling back another layer of their guarded lives. Henry confided in Lila about his struggles with his marriage, while Lila shared her frustrations with Ryan's controlling nature. They found solace in each other's company, their moments together becoming a refuge from the outside world. Yet, beneath the surface of their blossoming relationship, danger lurked. Lila's husband Ryan was no fool. He noticed the way her demeanor changed, how she seemed lighter, more confident, traits she hadn't displayed in years. His suspicion grew with each passing day, and he began monitoring her closely, questioning her every move. Lila brushed off his accusations, but the tension at home became unbearable. Meanwhile, Margaret's quiet observations of her husband's behavior began to crystallize into certainty. The late nights, the sudden secrecy, Henry wasn't just distracted, he was hiding something, or more likely, someone. Margaret's mind whirred with possibilities. She could confront him, demand answers, but where would that leave her? Instead, she resolved to wait and watch. If Henry thought he could outmaneuver her, he was gravely mistaken. By the time the leaves began to fall, the stage was set. Henry was ensnared in an affair he could no longer deny. Lila was trapped between her growing feelings and the storm brewing at home, and Margaret's quiet determination had turned to steely resolve. None of them could foresee the darkness looming ahead. But one thing was certain, in Willow Creek, secrets never stayed buried for long. Willow Creek thrived on its tranquility, a town where life unfolded in quiet rhythms. But for Lila Collins, tranquility felt more like stagnation. At 28 years old, she was trapped in a marriage that seemed perfect on the outside but was anything but. Her husband, Ryan Collins, was a man of strong principles and an unrelenting need for control. In the early days, Lila had mistaken his attention for devotion, but over time, his protective nature morphed into something suffocating. Every decision, every movement, every word was scrutinized under the weight of Ryan's insecurities. She longed for an escape, a fresh start, a life where she could breathe again. That longing led her to the Carter Family Clinic, a beacon of opportunity nestled in the heart of Willow Creek. On a brisk morning in May 2018, Lila walked into the clinic, her heels clicking nervously on the polished floors. The air smelled faintly of disinfectant, mixed with the comforting aroma of fresh coffee brewing in the staff lounge. The walls were painted a calming shade of blue, adorned with framed pictures of smiling families and certificates of excellence. Lila clutched her resume tightly, hoping this small act of courage would be the first step toward reclaiming her life. It was in that moment that Dr. Henry Carter appeared. Lila hadn't known what to expect, a stern, no-nonsense doctor perhaps, but Henry was nothing like the image she'd conjured. At 50, he exuded a natural charisma, his smile warm and disarming. His salt and pepper hair and confident posture carried an air of authority, but his kind eyes hinted at a gentler side. As he extended his hand in greeting, Lila felt a spark, a momentary flicker of something she couldn't quite name. "Lila Collins, right?" Henry asked, glancing at her resume before gesturing toward his office. "Come in. Let's talk." The office was spacious but inviting, with bookshelves lined with medical texts and personal mementos. A framed photograph of Henry and his wife, Margaret, sat prominently on his desk, a detail Lila noted but quickly dismissed. During their conversation, Henry asked thoughtful questions about her experience and why she wanted to join the clinic. Lila, uncharacteristically candid, shared her desire for change and a sense of purpose. To her surprise, Henry listened intently, his interest genuine. "You seem like exactly the kind of person we need here," he said with a smile that lit up the room. "The job is yours if you want it." Lila's heart leaped. For the first time in years, she felt seen, appreciated. As she left the clinic that morning, clutching the offer letter, she couldn't shake the lingering warmth of Henry's words or the unexpected connection she'd felt. She told herself it was nothing more than admiration for a kind employer, but deep down, she knew better. The days that followed marked a turning point in Lila's life. Working at the clinic gave her a sense of independence she hadn't felt in years. She threw herself into her new role with enthusiasm, quickly earning the respect of her colleagues. Her natural charm and attentiveness made her a favorite among patients, while her meticulous attention to detail ensured the clinic ran like clockwork. Henry noticed, too. At first, their interactions were entirely professional, a simple, "good morning," at the start of the day or a "thank you" after she'd organized patient files. But gradually, those moments stretched into longer conversations. They'd chat over coffee in the break room, sharing stories about their lives. Lila spoke of her childhood dreams and the struggles of her current marriage, while Henry confided in her about the growing distance in his own. It was during one of these conversations that the barriers between them began to crumble. One evening, as the last patient left and the clinic grew quiet, Henry found Lila tidying up the reception desk. She looked up, startled, as he approached. "You're always the last to leave," he said with a smile. "You don't have to work so hard, you know." "I don't mind," Lila replied, her voice soft. "It's nice to feel useful." Henry's expression shifted, his eyes searching hers. "You're more than just useful, Lila. You're remarkable." The words hung in the air, heavier than either of them expected. Lila's cheeks flushed, and she quickly turned away, but the moment had already changed something between them. What began as fleeting glances and stolen moments soon deepened into something neither could ignore. Henry found himself lingering in the reception area more often, drawn to Lila's laughter and the light she seemed to bring into his life. For Lila, Henry was everything Ryan wasn't: kind, attentive, and endlessly fascinating. He listened to her dreams, her fears, her frustrations, and never dismissed her as overthinking or irrational. The first time their hands brushed, an accidental touch as they reached for the same file, they both froze. The electricity between them was undeniable. Henry pulled away quickly, muttering an apology, but the damage was done. That single moment unleashed a flood of emotions neither was prepared to confront. By the end of summer, their professional boundaries were all but non-existent. Late evenings at the clinic turned into walks in the park, and their conversations became increasingly personal. Henry would talk about his discontent at home, the strained relationship with Margaret, and how he felt like a stranger in his own life. Lila, in turn, shared her unhappiness with Ryan's controlling nature and her longing for freedom. Yet, beneath the surface of their growing connection, both knew they were treading on dangerous ground. Henry still wore the mask of a devoted husband, and Lila was well aware of the risk she was taking. But the allure of their bond was too strong, the temptation too great. In the shadows of the clinic, an affair began to blossom, one built on shared longing and the thrill of secrecy. But as their emotions deepened, so too did the risks. Neither Henry nor Lila could foresee the storm brewing just beyond the horizon, a storm that would forever change the lives of everyone in Willow Creek. By the time summer gave way to autumn in Willow Creek, the once subtle connection between Henry Carter and Lila Collins had grown into something neither could contain. The walls of Carter Family Clinic, once a sanctuary of professionalism, now held secrets that threatened to destroy lives. The air between them was charged with an intensity that lingered long after their stolen moments together. But what had begun as a thrilling escape for both now teetered on the brink of chaos. Henry, ever the composed and charming professional, found himself increasingly distracted. Patients noticed his absent-mindedness, staff whispered about his uncharacteristic moods, and even his wife, Margaret, began to sense the shift. At home, Henry's facade of the devoted husband was crumbling under the weight of his double life. Margaret, a woman of quiet intelligence, observed his every move with growing suspicion. The late nights, the unexplained absences, the sudden uptick in his phone notifications, it all pointed to one thing. Yet, Margaret remained silent, biding her time, determined to uncover the truth on her own terms. For Lila, the affair had become a whirlwind of passion and turmoil. Every text message from Henry, every glance exchanged at the clinic, sent her heart racing. She was intoxicated by the way he made her feel, desired, valued, seen. For years, her life with Ryan Collins had been a prison of suffocating rules and expectations. Henry was her freedom, her rebellion against a life she no longer wanted. Yet, with every stolen kiss, every whispered promise, doubt began to creep in. How could a man so tethered to his life with Margaret ever truly be hers? As the leaves turned and the days grew shorter, the tension in their lives escalated. At the clinic, their interactions became less guarded. Colleagues noticed the lingering touches, the shared smiles, the way Henry's attention seemed to drift toward Lila whenever she was in the room. Rumors began to swirl, quiet murmurs that didn't take long to reach Margaret's ears. While others speculated idly, Margaret listened intently, piecing together a picture that confirmed her darkest fears. At home, Lila's life with Ryan was unraveling. His suspicion had transformed into outright paranoia. He questioned her constantly, where she'd been, who she was texting, why she seemed so distant. Ryan's controlling nature, once a quiet force, now manifested in volatile arguments and accusations. Lila felt the walls closing in. Her affair with Henry, once a source of excitement, now felt like a dangerous game. She lived in constant fear that Ryan would discover the truth, yet she couldn't bring herself to end the relationship. Henry was the one thing in her life that felt real. Meanwhile, Henry was struggling to maintain control. His relationship with Lila had awakened something within him, a sense of vitality he hadn't felt in years, but it also brought with it an unbearable weight. The lies, the deception, the delicate balancing act between his life with Margaret and his secret with Lila, it was all becoming too much. And then there was Margaret. Though she hadn't said a word about her suspicions, Henry could feel her watching him, her sharp gaze cutting through his carefully constructed facade. Every interaction with her felt like a test, every silence a threat. It was Margaret's silence that unsettled him most. She wasn't the type to overlook indiscretions. If she suspected something, she would act, but not impulsively. Margaret played the long game, and that knowledge gnawed at Henry. He began to withdraw from her even more, a decision that only fueled her determination. Margaret knew her husband better than anyone, and she recognized his behavior for what it was, guilt. As October arrived, the strain on Henry and Lila's relationship reached a breaking point. Their once thrilling rendezvous now carried an undercurrent of desperation. Lila wanted more than the stolen moments and empty promises. She wanted Henry to leave Margaret, to choose her, to prove that what they had was real. But every time she broached the subject, Henry evaded her questions or offered excuses. "You don't understand how complicated this is," he said one night as they sat together in a secluded corner of Moonlight Cafe. "Complicated?" Lila's voice trembled with frustration. "It's always complicated with you, Henry. But I've given you everything. Don't I deserve the same?" Henry looked away, guilt etched across his face. He couldn't bring himself to admit the truth, that while he cared for Lila, she was never part of his long-term plans. Lila was a reprieve, a way to escape the monotony of his life, but the thought of leaving Margaret, of dismantling the life he had built, was unthinkable. Lila left the cafe that night with tears streaming down her face, her heart heavy with disappointment. Her doubts about Henry's intentions solidified into a painful certainty. She had placed her hopes, her dreams, her very sense of self in the hands of a man who could never truly be hers. But instead of walking away, Lila clung tighter, convinced that if she just pushed harder, loved deeper, she could make him choose her. Unbeknownst to Henry and Lila, their lives were already spiraling out of control. Margaret, armed with the knowledge of their affair, had begun setting her plan into motion. She intercepted messages, tracked Henry's movements, and collected every piece of evidence she could find. But Margaret didn't confront him. Confrontation would be too simple, too satisfying. No, Margaret wanted something more, a reckoning that neither Henry nor Lila would see coming. As the first frost settled over Willow Creek, the fragile web of secrets and lies that held their lives together began to fray. Henry, Lila, Ryan, and Margaret, all were hurtling toward a collision they could no longer avoid. The stakes were higher than any of them realized, and when the storm broke, there would be no turning back. The air in Willow Creek had turned bitter with the approach of winter, but inside Dr. Henry Carter's sprawling Georgian home, the atmosphere was even colder. The walls that once echoed with quiet domesticity now felt like a battlefield waiting to erupt. Every secret, every lie, every stolen glance had led to this moment. For Lila Collins, the weight of her affair with Henry had become unbearable. What once filled her with excitement now suffocated her. Henry's constant evasions, his empty promises, it was all too much. She had sacrificed everything for him, her dignity, her safety, even her marriage. And yet, she felt no closer to the future he had whispered about in their stolen moments. That night, as she stared at her reflection in the mirror, her tear-streaked face staring back, a dark resolve took hold of her. Across town, Margaret Carter sat in her dimly lit study, sipping tea and watching the storm outside her window. She had spent months weaving her web, carefully guiding Lila toward desperation. The fake letters, the intercepted messages, the carefully planted seeds of doubt, every detail had been meticulously planned. Now, all she had to do was wait for the final piece of her strategy to fall into place. Margaret didn't need to confront Henry, she would let his lover do that for her. Tonight, everything would unfold exactly as she intended. It was well past midnight when Lila's car pulled up outside Henry's home. The house loomed in the darkness, its grand facade now seeming cold and foreboding. Her hands trembled as she turned off the ignition, gripping the steering wheel in a futile attempt to steady herself. This was it. She couldn't keep living in limbo, couldn't endure another day of feeling discarded. She needed answers. She needed him to choose. Lila pushed open the heavy front door, which Henry often left unlocked, a habit born of living in a safe town like Willow Creek. The faint glow of a desk lamp spilled out from his study, and she followed the light, her steps eerily silent on the hardwood floors. Inside, Henry sat at his desk, his head buried in paperwork. When he looked up and saw her standing in the doorway, his face paled. "Lila?" he asked, his voice tinged with a mix of surprise and irritation. "What are you doing here?" Lila stepped inside, her arms crossed tightly over her chest. "We need to talk, Henry. Now." Henry gestured toward the chair opposite his desk, but Lila shook her head. She stayed standing, her posture rigid, her emotions simmering dangerously close to the surface. "I can't keep doing this," she began, her voice trembling. "You keep saying you care about me, but you go home to her every night as if I don't exist. I need to know what we are. What this is." Henry sighed, running a hand through his graying hair. "Lila, we've talked about this. You know my situation." "No, Henry. I don't." Her voice cracked, her frustration spilling out. "All I know is that I've been giving you everything, and you've given me nothing in return. I can't live like this anymore." Henry stood, his expression softening as he tried to calm her. "Lila, you're important to me. You are. But this was never meant to be permanent." The words struck her like a physical blow. She staggered back, her breathing ragged. "Never meant to be permanent? What are you saying, Henry?" "I'm saying I can't leave Margaret," he admitted, his tone firm but regretful. "She's my wife. We've built a life together. This, what we had, it was never meant to last." Lila's heart shattered in that instant. Every moment they had shared, every promise he had made, every dream she had dared to believe in, it all crumbled into dust. Her vision blurred with tears, her chest heaving as the full weight of his betrayal sank in. "You used me," she whispered, her voice laced with equal parts sorrow and fury. "You used me to feel alive again, didn't you?" Henry said nothing. His silence was confirmation enough. In her anguish, Lila's eyes darted around the room, landing on the drawer of Henry's desk. She had seen him open it before, knew he kept a handgun there for protection, a remnant of his younger days living in a rougher neighborhood. Driven by a storm of emotions she could no longer control, she lunged for the drawer and yanked it open. The cold steel of the gun felt foreign in her trembling hands, but the surge of power it gave her was undeniable. "Lila, put that down," Henry said, his voice rising in alarm. He took a cautious step toward her, his hands raised in a placating gesture. You don't want to do this. You don't get to tell me what I want, she screamed, the gun shaking in her grip. You don't get to use me and then toss me aside like I'm nothing. Lila, please, Henry pleaded, his voice softer now. I made mistakes. I hurt you. I'm sorry. But this isn't the answer. But it was too late. The desperation, the betrayal, the heartbreak, it all boiled over in a single moment. Before she even realized what she was doing, her finger squeezed the trigger. The deafening sound of the gunshot shattered the stillness of the night. Henry collapsed to the floor, his eyes wide with disbelief as blood pooled around him. The room fell into an eerie silence, broken only by Lila's ragged breathing. She dropped the gun, her knees buckling as she sank to the floor beside Henry's lifeless body. Tears streamed down her face as the reality of what she had done hit her like a tidal wave. She reached out to touch his face, but the warmth was already beginning to fade. In the moments that followed, panic took hold. Lila scrambled to her feet, her mind racing. She couldn't go to prison. She couldn't let the world see her like this. She spotted a box cutter on Henry's desk and, in a desperate attempt to fabricate a story, used it to inflict a shallow cut on her arm. With blood dripping down her sleeve, she rehearsed the words she would say to the police. But as the sound of sirens grew closer, she knew there was no escaping the storm she had unleashed. In her quest for love, for validation, for meaning, Lila had crossed a line from which there was no return. The silence in Henry Carter's study was deafening after the gunshot's echo faded. Blood pooled around his body, soaking into the pristine rug beneath him. Lila Collins stood frozen, her trembling hands still clutching the gun she had dropped moments earlier. The reality of what she had done pressed down on her like an unbearable weight. She hadn't planned this, hadn't thought beyond the blinding rage that overtook her. Now, as she stared at Henry's lifeless body, panic set in. Her breathing grew shallow, her mind racing to make sense of the chaos she had created. She glanced at her reflection in the polished glass of a nearby cabinet. Her tear-streaked face was pale, her eyes wide with terror. Lila knew she had to act, but what could she do? She couldn't let herself be painted as a cold-blooded killer. She had to make them believe it wasn't her fault. Spotting a box cutter on Henry's desk, she grabbed it and inflicted a superficial cut on her forearm, wincing as the blade bit into her skin. She winced but pressed on, her hands shaking violently as blood trickled down her arm. She dropped the box cutter beside her, making sure it landed at an angle that suggested a struggle. In her mind, she rehearsed the story she would tell the police: Henry had attacked her. She had no choice but to defend herself. The sound of approaching sirens snapped her back to reality. Someone must have heard the gunshot and called for help. Lila stumbled into the living room, clutching her injured arm, and sank to the floor just as red and blue lights illuminated the front yard. By the time officers burst through the door, guns drawn, Lila was sitting in a pool of her own tears, cradling her arm and rocking back and forth. Lila's version of events tumbled out in disjointed fragments as the police tried to make sense of the scene. Her voice was high-pitched and shaky, her words laced with panic. He came at me, she stammered, gesturing toward her arm. He was angry. I didn't mean to. I just wanted him to stop. The officers exchanged glances but said little as they surveyed the scene. Henry's body lay in his study, the gun discarded nearby. Blood splattered the walls, stark against the warm, earthy tones of the room. A preliminary sweep revealed no signs of forced entry, no signs of a struggle, only the chilling tableau of a man shot dead in his own home. News of Henry's death reached Margaret Carter within hours. She arrived at the scene composed, her face carefully arranged into an expression of grief. To the outside world, Margaret appeared every bit the devastated widow, but inside, she felt nothing but cold satisfaction. She had orchestrated this chaos without lifting a finger, and now, all that remained was to ensure the truth stayed buried. Margaret was meticulous in her cooperation with the police. She recounted the growing strain in her marriage, her suspicions that Henry had been unfaithful, and the long nights he had spent away from home. She painted herself as a woman who had loved her husband despite his flaws, who had done everything in her power to save their marriage. She handed over Henry's phone records, emails, and text messages, evidence she had secretly collected for months. Each piece confirmed what the police already suspected: Henry had been having an affair with Lila, and it had ended in tragedy. At the station, detectives pressed Lila for details about the events leading up to Henry's death. Her story remained consistent on the surface. Henry had become angry during an argument, lunged at her, and she had acted in self-defense. But the more the detectives probed, the more inconsistencies began to emerge. The angle of the gunshot wound suggested Henry had been sitting when he was shot, contradicting Lila's claim that he had lunged at her. Furthermore, the lack of defensive wounds on Henry's body raised questions about her account of the struggle. The study was oddly pristine for a supposed altercation. Papers on Henry's desk remained undisturbed, the furniture unscathed. The only signs of violence were the gunshot wound and Lila's self-inflicted cut. Staff at the clinic provided testimonies about Henry and Lila's growing closeness. One receptionist recalled overhearing heated arguments between them after hours. Another reported seeing Lila leave the clinic in tears just days before Henry's death. The case quickly became a media sensation, with headlines blaring across the nation: "Affair turns deadly in small town," and "Doctor's secret love affair ends in tragedy." Reporters camped outside the Carter estate and the police station, eager for any scrap of information. The public was divided. Some sympathized with Lila, seeing her as a vulnerable woman driven to desperation by a manipulative older man. Others painted her as a femme fatale, seducing her way into Henry's life and tearing it apart. Margaret, ever the skilled manipulator, played her role flawlessly. In interviews, she spoke of her late husband's kindness and dedication to his work, lamenting the betrayal she hadn't seen coming. "He was flawed," she admitted, her voice trembling. "But no one deserves what happened to him." By December, the police had enough evidence to formally charge Lila with first-degree murder. The forensic inconsistencies, combined with the testimonies from clinic staff and Margaret's damning evidence, painted a clear picture of premeditation. Detectives believed Lila had gone to Henry's house that night with the intent to confront him, and when things didn't go her way, she snapped. As Lila sat in her holding cell, the gravity of her situation began to sink in. The media had turned against her, the police were building a solid case, and Margaret, always so composed, always one step ahead, had successfully cast herself as the grieving widow. Lila realized too late that she had been a pawn in a game far larger than she could have imagined. In the end, the investigation concluded that the affair between Henry and Lila, coupled with her emotional instability, had led to the fatal confrontation. But for those who truly understood the undercurrents of the case, it was clear that the tragedy of Henry Carter's death was not the result of one person's actions, but the culmination of lies, manipulation, and betrayal. The storm had finally broken, leaving nothing but devastation in its wake. The trial of Lila Collins, accused of the first-degree murder of Dr. Henry Carter, began in the spring of 2019, drawing massive attention from both the media and the residents of Willow Creek. The case had already become a nationwide spectacle, a tantalizing mix of scandal, betrayal, and tragedy. Reporters packed the small courthouse, their cameras flashing as Lila was led inside, her wrists shackled and her face pale from months in confinement. Lila's once vibrant demeanor was gone, replaced by a haunted expression. She wore the standard black and white prison jumpsuit, a stark contrast to the fashionable outfits she had once donned at the clinic. Her lawyer, a seasoned defense attorney named Richard Hayes, walked beside her, his face a mask of calm determination. The prosecution, led by District Attorney Samantha Boyd, was equally prepared, armed with a mountain of evidence that painted Lila as a scorned lover driven to murder. From the outset, the prosecution framed Lila as a woman consumed by obsession. They presented a timeline of her affair with Henry, supported by text messages, emails, and testimony from clinic staff. Witnesses recounted how Lila had become increasingly possessive and erratic in the weeks leading up to the murder, including several instances where she had confronted Henry about his unwillingness to leave his wife. The most damning evidence came from the forensic report. The prosecution highlighted the following points. Gunshot evidence. The angle of the bullet indicated that Henry had been sitting when he was shot, undermining Lila's claim of self-defense. Lack of struggle. There were no defensive wounds on Henry's body, nor any signs of a physical altercation in the study. Self-inflicted injury. Lila's arm wound was shallow and clearly self-inflicted, an act the prosecution argued was a desperate attempt to fabricate a story of self-defense. Samantha Boyd's closing argument was as sharp as it was emotional. This was not a moment of fear, she told the jury. This was a moment of rage. Lila Collins went to Henry Carter's house that night, armed with her jealousy and her desperation, and she pulled the trigger because she couldn't accept the truth: he was never going to leave his wife. Richard Hayes, however, had a different story to tell. He portrayed Lila as a vulnerable young woman manipulated by a man in a position of power. He painted Henry as a charismatic but deeply flawed figure who had lured Lila into an affair under false pretenses, exploiting her unhappiness and insecurities for his own gratification. The defense leaned heavily on the emotional toll of Lila's toxic marriage to Ryan Collins. Richard introduced testimony from friends who described Ryan as controlling and emotionally abusive, arguing that Lila had been trapped in a cycle of manipulation for years. Henry, he contended, had represented a beacon of hope for her, a way out of her suffocating life. When that hope was shattered, her actions were driven by fear and emotional instability, not premeditation. Richard also called attention to Margaret Carter's role in the case. While he couldn't directly accuse her of orchestrating events, he pointed out the suspicious timing of her evidence and her calculated demeanor throughout the investigation. This case, he argued, isn't as simple as the prosecution would have you believe. There are layers to this tragedy, and my client is not the cold-blooded killer they claim she is. The courtroom held its breath as Margaret Carter took the stand. Dressed in black, her every movement exuded the composed elegance of a grieving widow. Margaret spoke of her late husband with a mixture of sorrow and grace, describing him as a devoted doctor who had made mistakes but didn't deserve his fate. Her testimony was devastating for Lila's defense. Margaret confirmed that she had suspected the affair for months and had even confronted Henry about it, but she had chosen to stay silent to protect their marriage. "I didn't want to believe it," she said, her voice trembling. "I thought if I gave him time, he would come back to me." Her carefully chosen words painted a picture of betrayal and heartbreak, leaving the jury sympathetic to her loss. Margaret never directly implicated Lila as a monster, but her tone conveyed quiet disdain, as though Lila had been nothing more than a passing temptation Henry had foolishly indulged. After 2 weeks of testimony and days of deliberation, the jury reached their decision. The courtroom was packed as the foreperson stood to deliver the verdict. Lila sat motionless, her hands clenched tightly in her lap. "We, the jury, find the defendant, Lila Collins, guilty of murder in the first degree." A collective gasp rippled through the room. Lila's face crumpled as the weight of the verdict sank in. Tears streamed down her cheeks, but she made no sound, her body trembling with the effort to maintain composure. Margaret, seated in the gallery, allowed a single tear to slide down her cheek, her expression a careful balance of sorrow and satisfaction. After 2 weeks of testimony and days of deliberation, the jury reached their decision. The courtroom was packed as the foreperson stood to deliver the verdict. Lila sat motionless, her hands clenched tightly in her lap. "We, the jury, find the defendant, Lila Collins, guilty of murder in the first degree." A collective gasp rippled through the room. Lila's face crumpled as the weight of the verdict sank in. Tears streamed down her cheeks, but she made no sound, her body trembling with the effort to maintain composure. Margaret, seated in the gallery, allowed a single tear to slide down her cheek, her expression a careful balance of sorrow and satisfaction. Lila was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. She was led away in handcuffs, her once bright future now reduced to the cold monotony of a prison cell. Behind bars, she replayed the events of that night over and over, haunted by the man she had loved and the life she had destroyed. Margaret Carter, meanwhile, retreated from public life. She sold the family home and moved to California, where she started anew. Though she had won, in the eyes of many, the truth of her role in the tragedy remained buried. To the world, she was the grieving widow who had endured betrayal and heartbreak, but Margaret knew better. She had played her part masterfully, and the outcome had been exactly as she planned. The case left an indelible mark on Willow Creek. It became a cautionary tale, discussed in classrooms and community centers as a stark reminder of the dangers of unchecked desire and the devastating consequences of betrayal. For all its salacious details, the story at its core was one of human frailty, a tangled web of love, lies, and loss. As the years passed, the names of Henry Carter, Lila Collins, and Margaret Carter faded from the headlines, but the echoes of their choices lingered. In the quiet corners of Willow Creek, where secrets once flourished, their tragedy served as a chilling reminder: passion, when left unchecked, could destroy even the most carefully constructed lives. As the dust settled over Willow Creek, the story of Dr. Henry Carter, Lila Collins, and Margaret Carter became the stuff of hushed whispers and cautionary tales. The once idyllic town, with its serene streets and tightly knit community, would never quite recover from the scandal that had shattered its image. For those closest to the tragedy, however, the scars were far deeper, leaving them to grapple with the choices that had led them to that fateful night. Lila Collins sat in the confines of her prison cell, staring blankly at the concrete walls that now defined her world. Each night, as the lights dimmed and the quiet settled, the memories returned with relentless clarity. She saw Henry's face, his eyes wide with shock and disbelief as he fell. She heard the echo of the gunshot that had shattered her life, and the silence that followed. Every stolen moment, every whispered promise, every decision she had made, it all replayed in an endless loop, a torment of her own making. She had loved Henry, or at least she had believed she had. But now, from the stark perspective of confinement, she questioned whether it had truly been love or a desperate need to escape her own unhappiness. Whatever it was, it had consumed her, and in the end, it had destroyed everything. The future she had dreamed of with Henry was gone, replaced by a lifetime of reflection and regret. But even in the silence of her cell, Lila couldn't escape the feeling that she hadn't been the only one played. The calculated precision of Margaret's actions, the conveniently timed evidence, the subtle nudges that had pushed Lila to the edge, lingered in her mind. Had she been manipulated into doing Margaret's dirty work? It was a question she would never have the answer to, and that unanswered doubt was a punishment of its own. For Margaret Carter, life after Henry's death was one of quiet reinvention. She sold the Carter estate and moved to a sunny villa in California, far from the shadows of Willow Creek. To those who knew her, Margaret appeared to have found peace, rebuilding her life with grace after the scandal that had nearly destroyed her family. But behind closed doors, Margaret was a woman who lived with the weight of her choices. She had won. She had protected her husband's legacy, preserved her dignity, and ensured that the blame for his downfall fell squarely on the shoulders of the woman he had betrayed her for. Yet, victory tasted hollow. Margaret knew that her victory had come at a cost: her own humanity. The guilt was manageable, buried beneath layers of rationalization, but it surfaced in quiet moments when the facade slipped. She would never admit it, not even to herself, but she was as much a part of Henry's death as Lila had been. Her solitude in California suited her. The reporters eventually stopped calling, the whispers faded, and the story became another footnote in the annals of scandal. But Margaret carried the truth with her, a secret she would take to her grave. In the quiet of her new home, she often wondered if she had truly won, or if the price of her triumph was too high to bear. Willow Creek, for all its outward charm, was forever marked by the events of 2018. The Carter estate stood empty for months before a new family moved in, unaware of its tragic history. Locals continued to talk about the scandal in hushed tones, each retelling adding new embellishments to an already sensational story. For some, it was a tale of betrayal and obsession; for others, it was a cautionary reminder of how secrets could destroy lives. But for the younger generation, the story became something else entirely, a lesson in choices and consequences. In classrooms and therapy groups, the tragedy of Henry Carter, Lila Collins, and Margaret Carter was discussed as a case study in human behavior. Experts dissected the psychological motivations, the destructive power of jealousy, and the ripple effects of infidelity. What could have been different? How could lives have been saved? These questions lingered, offering no easy answers. In the end, the story of Henry, Lila, and Margaret was one of flawed people making flawed choices. Each of them had sought something: love, escape, control, but in their pursuit, they had lost sight of the cost. Their lives intersected in a storm of passion and betrayal, and the fallout was a tragedy that left no one unscathed. For Lila, the lesson came too late. For Margaret, the victory came with a price. And for Henry, the mistakes he made cost him everything. What do you think about the choices made by the characters in this story? Do you sympathize with Lila, or do you see her as a villain in her own right? Was Margaret justified in her actions, or did she go too far in protecting herself? Could Henry have avoided his tragic fate if he had made different decisions? We want to hear from you. Leave a comment below and share your thoughts. And don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more gripping stories like this one.